Hi there. This is the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Hey, you know, the globe is run by a corrupt kleptocracy. We've talked about it on this show before. News on this front, Stacy Herbert.
Max, that's correct. And we see this in the first headline, the subtext of it all. Fed's Fisher says monetary policy not cure for nation's fiscal pathology. So this is Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas President Richard Fisher, and he said that monetary policy isn't a, quote, salve for the nation's fiscal pathology, and that Congress should focus on reducing the federal deficit and creating incentives for companies to grow.
Yeah, well, fiscal meaning tax. They're saying that there's only so much tweaking the plumbing of the banking system can do. At some point, people who are elected to govern must govern. They simply can't sit back and hope that you can turn a dial here and turn a dial there and do all the work for you. You actually have to do work. When you're elected to an office somewhere, you actually got to do some work.
Well, also, our monetary policy is about feeding the oligarchs and entrenching this oligarchy. So you need to do something to change that. And I mean, the last Federal Open Market Committee that met last month voted to push ahead with its plan to stimulate the economy by purchasing $600 billion of bonds through June. Fisher says of this program, this roughly means we are purchasing the equivalent of all newly issued Treasury debt through June.
Right, well, 20 years ago, for every dollar of debt that was created, you got about $1 in GDP. Up until 2007, this was kind of working, more debt, more GDP. But it took $5, $6, $7 of debt to create that same $1 of GDP. Then starting in 2007, the economy flatlined, it died, and now pumping more credit into the system is like giving a blood transfusion to a corpse. It's not having any effect at all. They're already got interest rates down to zero. So he's saying we can't make interest rates any lower than zero, so there's not going to be any growth coming from pumping the economy with interest rate machinations. You've got to do something on your side, on the fiscal side, on the governance side. But of course, all the people who are in a position of governance are in the pocket of the bankers who lobby for 0% interest rates. So don't look for any cure there either.
Well, exactly. And all these 0% interest rates, it only helps the bankers. It does not help the population. As we've seen and we've been reporting, there have been food riots and riots all over the world because of the economic crisis, whether it's in Europe or Latin America or North Africa. We're seeing riots, and this is a direct result of this fiscal insanity, really. The refusal to decrease the size of these oligarchic banks that control the money supply and to stop giving them free money. They have to be pushed away.
Yeah, the free money makes it cheaper to speculate on commodity futures contracts, driving the price of paper cotton, paper wheat, paper corn, and paper food higher, starving people. And also the cheap money makes it possible to buy credit default swaps in the sovereign bond market in Europe and crash the sovereign bond markets and to impose austerity measures and IMF control in Europe. So the cheap money causes deflation in Europe and inflation in India. It all goes back to the cheap money. And the cheap money, of course, is controlled by the speculators who like it cheap because they don't want to pay any money for them, anything for the money they use to speculate with. And whenever they do get into a bind by losing a penny, they get the government to bail them out. Then the government imposes austerity measures, and the whole thing is turned into one big kleptocracy.
Well, this follows in the next headline, this kleptocracy we see at work. Quote of the day, Bill Daley will get it done. So he's quoting Simon Johnson, the former chief economist at the IMF, and he's talking about the completion of the banking sector's takeover of Washington, D.C., when he says, let's be honest, with the appointment of Bill Daley, the big banks have won completely this round of boom-bust bailout. The risk inherent to our financial system is now higher than it was in the early to mid-2000s. We are set up for another illusory financial expansion and another debilitating crisis. Bill Daley will get it done. Barry Ritholtz says, in other words, we are...
What? Hey, so in other words, this whole period is bookended nicely with 2008, Hank Paulson in front of Congress putting a gun to Congress's head and extorting $750 billion, we now know that went to overseas banks, his buddies at Goldman Sachs. The purpose he stated he would use for the money, he switched. It was a bait and switch. And that was a fraud and a crime and a heist, the biggest in history up until that time. Flash forward to now, at the other side of that particular phase in the kleptocracy of America, kakistocracy, ruled by the least qualified, the kakistocracy. And you have what you're talking about now, this guy Daley, who is put in place by J.P. Morgan to become the chief of staff in the White House under Obama, former J.P. Morgan guy. So Paulson got the money stolen, and now the J.P. Morgan guy makes sure that they put up barriers. No investigation, no prosecution, no bankers in jail like in the 80s when over 1,500 went to jail. It's a perfect crime.
Well, because recall, during the crisis, and this was also during the last elections, the biggest problem across all party lines, everybody said it was because the banks were too big to fail and we needed to reduce the size of the banks. Well, according to Simon Johnson and the latest available data, Q3 of 2010, the big six banks had assets worth 64% of US GDP. This is up from before the crisis. Assets in the big six at the end of 2006 were only about 55% of GDP, and this is up massively from 1995 when these same banks were only 17% of GDP.
The psychological profile of Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, this guy Daley, is that of the arsonist. The arsonist likes to burn things down. They're pyromaniacs. Here on Wall Street, you've got debt maniacs. They like to destroy things with debt, and they like the price of debt to be as cheap as a pack of matches. If the price of debt is as cheap as a pack of matches as it is now, they can continue to burn things down, to destroy the economy, like they're doing at this very moment. And what is the Obama administration doing? They are giving the pyromaniacs and the arsonists more starting fluid, more lighter fluid, more matches, whatever they need to destroy the economy. So you have to ask a question. Is Obama in the pocket of the financial terrorist? Yes, he is. Duh! I mean, get it through your thick skull. It's a kleptocracy. He's just a part of the kleptocracy.
Well, you talk about arsonists. Here's a headline from the UK. The other half of, or the other 10% of the global financial terrorist class. Bankers will take bonuses because they weren't praised last year, says Lord Jones. He's a former Labour minister, and now he's the chairman of HSBC's International Advisory Board. You know, they jump back and forth between politics and business. He said that bankers will take bumper bonuses this year because those that sacrificed big cash rewards, they sacrificed those big cash rewards last year. They did not receive not one jot of praise.
Come on the show and explain to me why you're not stealing the money. If you can't come on the show, that's a tacit admission that you're committing fraud, which is my contention. You're committing fraud. HSBC, Barclays, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, you commit fraud on a daily basis. It's a law against it. You're not being prosecuted. Doesn't make it right. It just means you have a weak prosecution in place. You're still committing fraud. And you're causing, in the inflation markets and around the world, people to die every day. You're killing people from starvation. You are murdering people right now, and you have the temerity to say that you deserve a bonus?
Well, he's saying it like this. To be fair, when the chief executives of the major banks sacrificed their contractual entitlements to bonuses over the past couple of years or gave the cash to charity, not one jot of praise or even understanding came their way. Well, what about us sacrificing our human rights, our constitutional rights, our rights to a monetary system that isn't destroyed by these very same bankers, and to be free of debt that they impose on us, whether we want it or not? Even the people who were not in debt had these bankers' debts thrust upon them via this kleptocracy that goes back and forth between politics and the banking sector.
Yeah, and these contracts that they refer to are about as sound as the contracts between the mortgage lenders and the borrowers relating to now the foreclosure crisis. In other words, these contracts are not worth the paper they're printed on. They're fraudulently induced, fraudulently conceived, and that's another part of the criminality, the syndicate of crime that's plaguing the global economy. And these fellows here are, as I've said, they're arsonists at best. That's the nicest thing you can say about them.
So at the top of the show, we mentioned that the Fed the Dallas Fed's president, Fisher, commented on the overuse of monetary policy. We're going to end on another result of this, as we're seeing in the global markets. Oil prices help widen UK's trade gap. So Britain's trade gap with the rest of the world, unexpectedly to them, touched another new record in November as the high price of oil helped push up the bill for imports. So experts were expecting that the trade deficit would actually decline. Instead, it increased sharply. And that's because the UK has suddenly become an oil importer. After being an exporter, a net exporter for the past few decades, it's now an importer. And because all of the monetary policy is about destroying your currency in the name of trade policy, and yet it's causing inflation and economic insanity in your own economy. So there's this tug of war, and the currency war is basically that the oil is winning.
Yeah, the key word there is unexpected.
Yeah.
That the oil ran out unexpectedly. You know, this is the magic pudding theory, that if you have a bowl of pudding, you can just keep eating from this bowl, and the bowl never runs out of pudding. It's the magic pudding.
I've never heard of the magic pudding theory. You see, you learn something new on this show all the time.
The UK ministers believe that you can just keep drilling and pumping oil from the North Sea, and it just replenishes itself magically, that there is no bottom to the end of that bowl. And it's unexpected. They unexpectedly ran out of oil in America in the 70s. They unexpectedly have run out of oil in Kuwait, in the Bergen field. Oh, they've unexpectedly run out of oil in Cantrell in Mexico. Oh, the world unexpectedly hit peak oil in 2007 along with peak credit. And it's all very unexpected. Unless you've got a 5th grade education, then it's completely predictable.
And you could predict that it's going to get worse from this final brief headline regarding this, a consequence of the increase in oil imports. Sterling falls after UK trade gap widens to record. So the UK trade gap widens because of the increase in oil imports, thus causing the sterling to fall, thus causing naturally the price of oil, which is priced in dollars, to be more costly to the UK.
Hello, George Soros. It's 1993 again. Time to kill the pound sterling. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away much more. Even if you're on the way to the gate to get on the airplane, stop and watch the second half of the show, because it's more interesting than wherever it is you think you're going. So stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. All righty. You know, everyone's concerned about the whole explosion in debt for governments, for corporations, and for people. Let me introduce you first, David Malone. You're jumping the gun there, buddy. Let me introduce David Malone, author of Debt Generation. Welcome to the Keiser Report, David.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Max.
All right, David Malone, first tell us about your book, Debt Generation. Who is the debt generation, and why are they in so much debt?
Well, sadly, I think we are the debt generation. And as far as I'm concerned, the reason we're in so much debt is because our governments have forced us to be in so much debt, and not for our benefit.
Well, let's walk through how the government's forced this debt upon us. My understanding is that they bailed out the banks, and then they didn't want to keep that debt on their balance sheet, so they decided to force it on the population. Is that about the size of it?
That is exactly the size of it. No one asked me. I don't remember there being any discussion, and that's the bit that rankles most with me.
All right, so you've got folks in the UK in the street. They're protesting the banks. They're protesting folks like Philip Green over there at Topshop, who was abusing the tax code, who took $1 billion dividend in his wife's name, avoided the taxation, put the company Arcadia in a leveraged position. You've got protests against Vodafone. You've got anger in the street from this debt generation. They seem to be getting smarter in terms of pushing back with these flash mobs and these protests. Is the debt generation going to be successful in getting the government to maybe re-examine how they've gone about doing things?
Well, I think so. I think what's crucial this year is if the protests continue to be isolated, with a protest against schools closing here and a protest against hospitals closing there, then I think the protest will fail, because it'd be too easy to turn one against the other. But I think if this year the protests can find a common cause, and instead of saying, oh, don't cut ours, cut theirs, they can say, why are we having these cuts? Who has all the money been given to? Then I think the debt generation can fight back effectively.
Now, it would be interesting if the people protesting against the banks and what's going on with this debt pushing did not have an example of a country that did fight back, but they do. They have Iceland to point to. Iceland let the banks fail. The economy went through a gut-wrenching restarting process, and now they're back on the way to growth. What is this government? How can they, with a straight face, say that they couldn't possibly let the corrupt banks fail when that's clearly a lie?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, here, everyone says, 2 years ago, everyone said, oh, look at Ireland. Ireland is doing the right thing. Ireland will be the first one through. And look at Ireland. They're not even on their knees. They're on their backs now. Whereas, exactly as you say, Iceland took a long pause and said, let's ask the people. And the people said, no, thank you. No, why should we bail out these reckless banks? And they didn't. And here they are already beginning to pull through. No one's saying it wasn't painful or that there won't be a lot more pain. There's no pain-free way out of where we are. But they are pulling through in a way which Ireland isn't. Ireland is sinking, the supposed shining example. And how the banks and the government here can make sure that nobody looks at Iceland, I don't understand, other than the fact that they have the wholehearted collusion of the media.
Yeah, it's propaganda. And you know, in the case of these banks that are holding the government hostage and forcing the people to pay debts that they had no part in incurring to begin with, it's really a form of larceny and financial rape. Now, it was reported recently about 2 million people are using credit cards to pay their mortgages or rent. Now, where's this going?
Well, nowhere good. I mean, once you start using your credit card, what would it be, 18% interest to pay off your mortgage? Well, that's like sailors in a boat cast adrift who start drinking seawater. It might make you feel better for 5 minutes, but then it will kill you. I cannot understand how the financial press can't look at that and see it for the warning sign which it is. There's no good way out once people start using credit cards as a last gasp, unless they're being Machiavellian and saying, right, well, I'm going under, why not just max out the credit cards and then go out with a blaze of glory? Sadly, I don't think that's what it is. I think it's basically honest and desperate people making a mistake.
Yeah, you're right about the financial press. Just recently, the Financial Times wrote an editorial about the Goldman Sachs Facebook deal. Goldman Sachs violated securities laws by creating too many shares relative to SEC laws, and Financial Times simply said, well, there's nothing magical about that number. Well, I guess there's nothing magical about the whole concept of rule of law either. Now, you say that the response to the financial crisis is a crisis of democracy. What does that mean exactly?
What it means to me is, I don't know how it was in the States, but here, when the crisis got going properly, say 2008, there was never a moment when there was an open debate, when people said, well, what are the possible responses to this? Should we be bailing out insolvent banks? Is it really a liquidity crisis, or is it in fact a crisis of solvency? There was no debate. We simply had a lockstep chorus of one expert and politician, aided and abetted by a supine press, all saying exactly the same thing. There's no other alternative. It's a crisis of liquidity. We must bail out the banks. And there was no discussion. At no point was a discussion opened that people could hear different points of view. It was claimed there were no different points of view. A, that's a lie. And B, the decisions that have been made have been greater than the decisions involving wars. I mean, a whole generation will be blighted by those decisions. Nobody was asked. And it led me to think, wait a minute, is this a democracy or isn't it? Are we going to be treated as adults, or are we going to be condescended to? For me, it's one thing to have your wallet stolen, which I think is what has happened to us. It's another to then be condescended to by the man who stole it.
Yeah, you mentioned war. It's an interesting comparison because in the States they say, well, the debt to GDP ratio, it's not any greater than it was during World War II. Of course, the point of going into debt for World War II ended up in winning World War II, and the U.S. was in a fantastic position to go forward and pay off that debt with a period of growth. Here, the U.S. is in the same amount of debt, but they just lost. They lost the war against kleptocrats. They lost the war against predatory bankers. They lost the war against Wall Street bankers who have stolen all of their wealth. So they're starting this period having just lost a war, and they're in the same period of debt, and all the prognostication going forward is 2, 3, 4 times more debt. Now, also you mentioned Ireland and the UK. It's funny because the UK banks indebted to the Irish banks and vice versa. So in other words, the UK population is actually bailing out Irish banks.
Yes, but they are bailing out Irish banks, but what's always annoyed me even more is here there's the beginnings, across Europe, there's the beginnings of a sort of xenophobic backlash with the Germans saying, oh, we're bailing out those feckless Greeks, and the tabloids here saying, muttering darkly about bailing out the Irish. Whereas you and I both know that half of the money that's going to be taken to Ireland, to the Irish banks, will then be smartly returned to British banks because it's the British banks who we're ultimately bailing out. So we will blame the Irish, but get them to bail us out. It seems to me to be doubly unjust.
Right, so you have all of this bailout money and debt extending and pretending, ending up generating fees for the very bankers who created the debt to begin with. No GDP growth, no underlying growth, unemployment is skyrocketing. Now let's get back to generation debt for a second. How did they get into this debt? Well, we know that for 10 or 15 years they were told in the UK that by any means necessary, you must buy a house, even if it means taking on a 125% mortgage from Bradford and Bingley or Northern Rock. You must get on the property ladder. Okay, now the real estate market's crashed, the equity is underwater, but the debt remains on the books. That's how this generation ended up in debt for the most part, is this crash of this market. Now, does this generation debt understand the mechanics of how they got into debt?
I don't think they do, because they're constantly told that it was their own fault, that they were greedy, that they were reckless, that they took on debt which they shouldn't have, and it's being turned as if it's a moral story of the failings of the ordinary person. And the bit that doesn't work for me is, for that story, you've got to suppose that some car mechanic in Sheffield or a car mechanic in California wandered into a large bank and managed to bamboozle the bank manager or bamboozle the smartest men in the room in Wall Street and got them to give him a mortgage which he couldn't afford. Does that ring true to you, that the average person here outsmarted the banks and the banks went, oh damn, I can't believe they managed to persuade me to give them a mortgage which I can see that doesn't work? No, the banks pushed it. The banks said, exactly as you said, if you don't get on the property market, you're a fool, and by the way, we can help you do it.
Right, and we now know that those mortgages were fraudulently induced, fraudulently packaged, contracts were fraudulently written. They sold them into the secondary market to securitization, which was also fraud, and now they're trying to foreclose and committing additional fraud. But basically, let's be honest, Barclays, HSBC, Bradford and Bingley, Northern Rock, Royal Bank of Scotland, they are rapists. They have raped unmercifully these poor young people. And now they want to be portraying themselves as the victims. They're the rapists. So why can't they pass in the UK anti-financial rape laws? Rape is still illegal in the UK, last I checked, and these banks are raping people. Why can't they take them down to the Old Bailey and string them up for rape?
I agree with you that the rule of law is part of what's being undermined. It's why I say it's a crisis of democracy. I seriously wonder about the rule of law. But I go back to your when you were drawing the analogy with warfare. I mean, it's an old cliche, but the first casualty of war is the truth. And I think that's what's happened. I think the financial class have said this is a war, and it's a war they're fighting for their survival as they see it. And they think, therefore, any amount of lying, any amount of dissimulation is justified.
Okay, well, in any war, the role of propaganda is key. And this generation debt, it seems to me what they need is some proper propaganda to get themselves organized and to fight back the propaganda coming at them with their own propaganda. Is anyone organizing some good propaganda to do battle with these financial rapists?
There is a minority of people who aren't buying into the propaganda. I mean, you know that, and I know that. They read my blog and they watch your show. And although they're still a minority, I think the banks and the government should be worried because it's a growing minority. your viewership is growing, the people who read my blog, they're growing. And so I think there are more and more people who are waking up and saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, and I'm no longer going to blindly believe the high priests of finance when they say only they know what's going on. So I do think there's more than the beginnings. There's a maturing opposition who are beginning to get the courage to think to themselves, no, I think this priesthood is corrupt, and I think they're just selling us whatever message enriches them to our detriment.
All righty. Well, thanks for being on the Keiser Report, David Malone, author of Debt Generation.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure, Max.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, David Malone, author of Debt Generation. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying, bye, y'all.